everybody wants their relationships to work. So nobody gets into a relationship for it not to work. So we try everything. Unfortunately, couples counseling does not work when abuse is the issue, because it's not like normal marriage conflict. It's about one person using a pattern of behaviors to gain power and control over their intimate partner. Of course, God doesn't want divorce, marriages to end, but God would never sacrifice a person for the sake of a relationship. Separations are very functional, and our heart isn't for divorce. We would love to see every couple make it. We just can't make anybody do that, right? The abuser has to choose to change.
So today I have Stacey Womack here, and she is founder and executive director for Abuse Recover Ministry Services, ARMS, and she uses more than her 26 years of experience to educate, inform, and inspire leaders to better care for domestic violence victims and abusers through her debut book, On the Front Lines of Abuse: Strategies for the Faith Community. Her new book equips the faith community to address domestic abuse in a God-honoring way. In her book, she shares stories and practical advice based on years of experience. Welcome, Stacey.
Thank you.
It's so great to have you here.
I'm very excited to be here too. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, and I loved your book. It was amazing. I think it's going to be a wonderful tool for the faith community. But let's just start with your inspiration, how you got into working with domestic abuse victims, their survivors, all of that, and what inspired you.
So I have like a really crazy story that's way too long to tell. It would take the whole time we have. But the short answer is, in the midst of raising my family, I married young and had 6 children and homeschooled back in the day when no one really knew what homeschooling was. And in the midst of that, which was really my ministry, God began to speak to me about ministry beyond my family. And so I spent a couple years seeking God and what he would have me do. And this was the door he opened, and I stepped through it not knowing more about domestic abuse than the average person. And really, my heart is really to be obedient to God. And so I was confused by his choice, as I thought it would be something, he would pick something that I knew something about or something that was happy. But here we are. I never planned on starting a nonprofit. I was just going to help lead a couple groups of women through their healing process. And God had other plans. And here we are as a national and international organization providing these services.
Oh, that's fabulous. And you did have a neat personal connection, even though you had never experienced it, that really put it in the forefront to you. That was kind of a little bit of a surprise, I would imagine, as you didn't know where your sister was at the time until you learned more. So
yeah, and honestly, that happened quite a few years before I started. And as I mentioned in the book, I handled it like most people of faith do, mishandled it, I should say, giving her some, usual Christian comments and suggestions and that type of thing. And she was very, very gracious. I could kind of figure out that it was abuse because there was at least one event that would be considered physical. At that time, what most people would consider physical. There's definitely more physical than that isn't as obvious, but she was gracious, and I struggled with, I kind of think this is abusive. And she kind of had to go through that whole process without much support from our family. Not that we were against her, we just didn't know what to do. So it really wasn't my inspiration for doing this at all, honestly. This was, when I was asking God, what do you want me to do? This was not even a thought on my brain.
Right.
It wasn't even on my radar. So that's why, it was so interesting when God brought me into this. I had a lot of women that first year ask me, how can you be doing this when you haven't experienced it? And I really struggled with, how do I answer that question? And God, are you sure? Sure you've got the right person? Am I doing what you want me to do? And I remember reading an article from somebody really well known, and she also shared in there that had she not gone through the things she'd gone through, she couldn't do what she was doing today. And I said, there it is, good again, God, what do I do? And I just felt like God said to me, Stacey, Jesus served everyone, but he didn't go through everything.
That's
and
good.
And so that helped me to kind of overcome that. And then I also had a pastor say, Stacey, I've been very fortunate. I grew up in a Christian home. I have a wonderful husband. she goes, you're able to speak to health in a way that other people are not. And so I think that's been a benefit for me. It's also helped me to overcome some hurdles in talking to the faith community, as some pastors might, if I had been a survivor, might see me on my soapbox. Where here I can speak to, no, I'm a pastor's kid myself. I grew up in the church. I've been married a long time, and be able to kind of overcome some of those hurdles or barriers that might keep them from being willing to listen to what I have to say.
Yes, that makes
Yeah.
sense. It being, like you said, an example of health and a healthy relationship to a number of people that have not seen that. And
Yeah.
so that's huge, definitely. So in your book, you talk about this difference between, you kind of broke down different abuses, and you talk about
Mm.
spiritual abuse. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. A lot of people don't think about abuse in spiritual terms. In fact, there's just a few categories, and we have 8 categories of abuse that we talk about. But spiritual abuse is the misuse of scripture. An abuser may use the misuse of scripture, or even the faith community does this, sometimes misuses scriptures to get the victim to comply. And I call her a victim at this point because at this point she's still in the abuse. So it could be questioning her salvation, her theology, telling her that God doesn't love her. It's just when you mix faith and abuse, it just does terrible things to people. And I have seen it over and over. I've had pastors' kids in our groups, and all of our groups that we serve, both our victim recovery groups and also in our intervention groups for men and women who use abusive behaviors. And there's nothing that messes with your faith more. We also include any abuse done in front of a child, because like for our men, we tell them the most common analogy used for God is father. So if your earthly father is harsh, mean, and cruel, it's really hard to view God as loving, gracious, and kind. And even for our women, it's like you're still an earthly example of authority in your child's life, and they're feminine analogies for God in the Bible as well. So it's like it's important how we are with our kids, so that's why it's included in spiritual abuse too. So I have so many horror stories of things that pastors have said because they haven't been educated around this issue. And I have so many women say, Stacey, I love God, but I hate church because of what that's happened. But, I even had a man who just like was totally verbally abused his wife and then wanted to pray with her and thank God for what a wonderful wife he'd given him. And it was like that psychological abuse mixed in with that spiritual abuse is just really devastating.
Have you gone through a breakup that's kind of left you rattled and maybe questioning yourself some? Do you find that you're a pretty kind person that's chronically overgiving, overfunctioning, and maybe you're just plain tired and maybe a little resentful? Do you feel like you're going through the motions of life, but you're not really living your life? Well, that's what the Unravel Notebook is for. It's 61 days for you to create your life by intent and unravel your thoughts and beliefs so you can connect with God, yourself, and others in a better, more intentional way and live brighter.
Yes. And that was my experience. And a number of people that we all came from a similar church with a similar theology and teachings. And a number of those gals that got out of those relationships feel exactly like you mentioned, Stacey, where some of them actually don't even have a relationship with God anymore because
Yeah.
it is so destructive to their view of God to have something like that happen and have the church, address it because they're not aware of how to do it differently. And
Right.
yeah, and that your book was so good about explaining that and explaining the difference, and it was really good. So let's talk about that. A lot of times, like a couple will go to the church for counseling. Talk about the challenges with that when it's an abusive relationship and like how that gets distinguished or
Right.
missed.
Well, and I first want to say to anybody who's listening
Yeah.
that it's totally normal to do this, to go to counseling. Everybody wants their relationships to work, so nobody gets into a relationship for it not to work. So we try everything.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, couples counseling does not work when abuse is the issue because it's not like normal marriage conflict. It's about one person using a pattern of behaviors to gain power and control over their intimate partner. And so it's not about them coming to this counseling session where it's 50-50 and they've got to like, she's 50% responsible for his abuse then. It's like, what did you do to cause it kind of thing? And when really it's about, no, we need to separate the two and we need to work with them individually. She needs to get some healing. He needs to be addressed from this accountability side of how to gain some new belief systems that will help him to love like Christ loves. And honestly, when the guys do the very hard work with the guys who really work it hard and the relationships are able to make it, they don't even need couples counseling after that, because really that's all that was needed. So if they go to couples counseling, it actually puts her in danger, because if she's sharing secrets that he doesn't want shared, and now, they go home and they're alone, who's there for her to protect her? Or he may use all the information the counselor uses against her. So they're, again, I have so many horror stories about counselors who are well-meaning counselors who just totally mishandled this issue so poorly. And, I really, it just breaks my heart. Because like you said, for some women, where it should have been safe wasn't safe. And we find that when the women go through her journey, often in a church is where we hold them. Churches, it's not the only place we hold them, but it's a lot of our groups are there. They find a safe place within that group, and they find a way to re-engage them with the church again. And I know even for my sister, it's been a really hard go. She hasn't walked away from her faith, but not really that engagement with church, just because of her concerns over doing the very thing that we were taught when we were growing up you never do, right? Which is to divorce, which is,
Yes.
I get it.
Cardinal
I get
sin.
it. Yeah, I know, like the worst one in the Bible. So when the reality is that studies have been done on those scriptures that are used against women to get them to stay, about God hates divorce, there's so much more to that verse than what they're sharing, and who it's to, who it's addressed to, what the meaning actually means. That we actually have some really great articles on our website about that as well, but there's just some really better explanations. And being a pastor kid myself, it's been an interesting journey to navigate this, because of course God doesn't want divorce, marriages to end, but God would never sacrifice a person for the sake of a relationship. But the faith community does that because they're sometimes more concerned about keeping the couple together than about actually creating safety for this person who's in danger.
That's huge. Yeah, you mentioned some profound things in just what you said. First of all, that you don't encourage couples counseling, because what could look like typical couples challenges isn't, because of the power differential and how it's being used. That was really interesting. I actually talked to a friend about this yesterday and shared that with her, and she's like, wow, that would have been phenomenal if I had that go on, because she shared her experience. And so that's really profound. And then you talked about how sometimes people will elevate marriage over just protecting people. And at one point in the book, you talked about child abuse, that domestic abuse is really child abuse. Could you go expand more on that?
Sure. Yeah. As an organization, we don't believe that abuse is really an adult issue from God's perspective, because we are his children. So if you're a good parent and you send your child to school and they're beaten, harassed, and abused, you wouldn't, sit in your chair when they come through the door and they're crying. You wouldn't sit there and go back, my child, and pray harder and win them over by your quiet and gentle spirit. You wouldn't do that. You would go down to the school and you said, who's doing this to my child? And what are you going to do to make it stop? And if it didn't stop, as a good parent, we wouldn't think twice to remove our child from that situation.
Yes. So
why would we think a God who loves us more than our own children not want to do the same thing for us? And, I really, there's scriptures in the Bible that talks about the prudent man or woman sees danger and hides. There are appropriate times to actually separate and hide, and separate so that you can get some healing. In these situations that are domestic violence or domestic abuse related, even if it's not physical, but it's the other forms of abuse that are still bringing death to that person, separations are very functional And our heart isn't for divorce. We would love to see every couple make it. We just can't make anybody do that, right? The abuser has to choose to change.
Yes.
We can present the information and they have to choose what they're going to do with it. So we talk with the women about keeping their focus on God and not on what he is or isn't doing, and not putting her hope in him changing, but her hope in God, because that is only the most firm and sure place that she can be. He is our anchor. God is our anchor, no matter what happens. And we
that's
all need to
huge.
know that he's enough for us, that God's enough for us no matter what.
Mm-hmm. That
Yeah.
was another surprise in your book. So not only did you say, yeah, couples counseling, not ideal. You also said separation is not only, it's healthy, it's important, and a great part of the journey that you guys use and part of the process. And it makes such sense because then the victim is safe. And then you can deal with both of them. And I thought that was fabulous insight, and just from the
Yeah.
experiences worked really well.
And we do have couples who live together while they're working on, they're both going to our programs. But believe me, the process is super slow. And oftentimes they don't make it through because they're still focusing on one another.
Mm-hmm.
And I have couples that have made it who have done it while they're living in the same home, but it's a lot harder. And then I have couples who voluntarily, separate, and then he starts changing, or she feels encouraged by what he's sharing because he's finally starting to say things she's wanted to hear him say, and she lets him come home pretty quickly. We encourage our women, if you're going to separate, plan at least 6 months, because anybody can behave well for a short time. So to really see change, it's got to be sustained change.
Mm-hmm.
And so even in working with our men, sometimes I'll go to them and they're at a point of completion. And I tell them, I said, I think you've made some change, but I don't think it's sustainable at this point. So I'm encouraging you to stay, not complete yet, but it's up to you, so that you can sustain it. Because our heart as an organization is not to just help people change in that moment, but for it to be a lifetime change for them.
Yes, that's wonderful. I think one of the hardest things for me is there wasn't the physical abuse, and there was the psychological and spiritual, and
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting how you addressed psychological abuse, or basically you talked about like the soul dying, and mine got so bad where I ended up in the psych ward, which is interesting as you refer to mental challenges with abuse. So that's really interesting. So why don't you first talk about psychological abuse? And
Right.
how that can be kind of hard if there's not the physical abuse to really understand that it is abuse.
Yeah, psychological abuse is the number one form of abuse used, and all forms of abuse are psychological because they have an emotional impact on the person.
Yes.
And it is the hardest to identify because it looks like normal marital conflict, but it really is not. So, crazy making, mental coercion, gaslighting, whatever you want to call it, is usually the number one thing that is done, and it kind of eats away at the person's confidence and sense of self. So he might say, I didn't say that. I didn't do that, when he did say and do those things. Or he might tell you that you said or did things that you didn't say or do. He might tell you over and over that you're crazy. He might agree to something like your decision you made with the kids, and then at the last moment pulls out, so you're the bad one. Or he may, put things in weird places to make you think that you're going crazy because you can't remember where you put your things. So it's ongoing. It's in multiple areas. It doesn't have to be done with any yelling or swearing or name calling. It be done very, very calmly. And I have had one woman who was with me on and off for 3 years, and he was a well-respected educator, and all of the abuse was psychological. It wasn't obvious forms of abuse. And she kept trying to explain it to everybody. Mm-hmm. She would talk to her friends, and nobody understood it because it's so hard to explain to people that she ended up losing some of her sense of dignity and some of her friends along the way because she couldn't explain how it was different from just the normal conflicts that we have as couples at times. So this is, again, a way to, like you mentioned, we talk about it killing the soul, the mind, the will, and the emotions. So I use the analogy of standing at the ocean's edge. If you've ever done that, and the water laps at your feet and it pulls the sand out from underneath your feet. And if you don't move, you'll fall. So you do move. and then you move again, and then you move again. So that's what psychological abuse is like. You're doing that, you're trying to please the other person. You keep adjusting, keep adjusting, keep adjusting. And before long, you begin to wonder, okay, maybe I am the bad one here. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I am the abuser. So you begin to question yourself and you lose your sense of identity. So while the women go through our recovery program called Her Journey, which is free, they are able to, during that process, regain their sense of self and understand that they're valuable. Not just know it, but believe it with all their heart that God loves them, values them. And when you believe that, you make different choices. And it's a long journey to go on, but it's so well worth it. It's such an amazing thing to watch people change.
Oh, and I think that's the core, is that how much God values and how he sees his children, and that abuse of any kind is not what he desires. And it's not our job to be the suffering or the lamb that should be slain or any of those things. So it's very, and so in my case, it was very quiet. Like, it was very much a pull back and I won't talk to you for long periods of time to punish. So it was very hard to explain or have the words. And now, I have the words for it, but that was part of the problem. That was part of the mental challenges. Like, I don't have the words for it. And he looks so good from the outside.
Yeah.
That made it very challenging.
We've had some of our women whose husbands are in our program, and they'll call us and say, Stacey, he's stopped all the overt forms of abuse, the property abuse, the physical abuse, but he's up to psychological abuse. And I wish he'd hit me, because then people would actually recognize that what I'm experiencing is abuse. So this is why a guy's going through the program who is faking it in group, basically, but not really making change. So, it is true. It's just very, very, very damaging. And God cares about that stuff. Even if other people don't understand it, he cares about how we are doing internally and in our emotions and spiritually. I mean, we're body, soul, and spirit. So all those areas need to be addressed.
Stay tuned for our next
guys
episode.
are like, they didn't recognize it as abuse. They didn't see it as abuse. And most abusers see themselves as the victim. Some studies show that men who don't deal with their childhood trauma aren't able to sustain change. And if you've been in a relationship where you're being abused, you're in a state of trauma. So, and the abuser is doing what we call public image management. The way she's behaving, her trauma response to this looks like mental health. And so they might think, well, maybe she does have mental health issues. And so, again, she doesn't get the support she needs. And most often, our women have to leave the church they're part of because the church did not know how to handle it, or they handled it very poorly. So they either do nothing, which still leaves her in a very unsafe place, or they handle it poorly and tell her that she's being unsubmissive and disobedient to God, and all those kind of things that are women of faith hear over and over again. It's great that we're helping those who've suffered abuse, but if we're not doing something to stop those who are doing abuse, they just go out and make more victims.
Right.